Welcome to Energy Insights. Today we're speaking with Afu Utami about the recent Indonesian elections and energy policy in one of Asia's fastest growing countries. Afu is one of the founders of the technology-based political education movement Bijak Pemului that aims to encourage voters to become politically engaged and educated. The initiative won the MIT Solve Global competition in 2023. Afu is also the founder and CEO of Think Policy, an organization that aims to encourage innovation and ecosystem improvement in public policy in Indonesia. It also supports the general public to understand public policy in a more accessible way through an evidence-based approach. Before all this, Afu was an environmental economist at the World Bank and a researcher at the World Resources Institute. She's also worked with the Indonesian government on several projects on issues related to energy and ecosystem management. We talked about many topics that included not only the recent Indonesian elections and the subsequent energy policies of the new incoming government, but also about Indonesia's coal use, nickel processing facilities, and China's influence, how young voters are perceiving the government's energy policies, and environmental issues in Indonesia, and how voters are responding to the current challenges and changes in Indonesia's energy, political, and environmental landscapes. It was great talking with Afu, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Okay, so we are here with Afu Utami. Afu, thank you so much for coming on Energy Insights.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started talking about all things Indonesia and of course the recent election and also the subsequent energy policies of the new incoming administration, Afu, I'm wondering if you could just give us a brief background on who you are and your career history, if that's relevant.
Sure. So I've been, for the good parts of my professional journey, an environmental economist. I've been working on the climate policy issues through my work research with the World Resources Institute, the World Bank, among others. But last year, I switched track and started a political education movement called Vote Wisely that essentially engages young and especially first-time voters in Indonesia who are not attuned to the political context and issues in Indonesia through a website-based platform, basically, that has so far gathered more than 1 million users throughout the election. And through that engagement, I've met and heard from many young voters and better understood, I think, their concerns, their issues, including on climate change, but also beyond.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I do actually want to talk to you about young voters a bit later. But first, I think it'd be nice to just build some context for listeners who aren't aware. But I definitely do want to talk about the young voters, and it's a really good place. And I think you're the right person to answer some of those questions I have. But first, I think so. Indonesia recently just had their presidential election, and at this stage, it looks like the winner will be Prabowo Subianto, who will likely win. And I think I just wanted to start with one of the things that he mentioned on his campaign in regards to energy. Now, he said that he supports Indonesia transitioning away from coal, but he also said that this would be gradual. So I'm just wondering, what you make of that claim, and do you think that this is a genuine want for Indonesia to transition away from coal, or do you think that this is another kind of like just putting more barriers up onto getting towards more clean energy?
Yeah. The issue of energy transition in Indonesia, I think, is not anymore a question of whether or not. It's not a question of whether that's the direction that any of the three presidential candidates were going for, but it's an issue of velocity, of as in like how fast, what the speed would be, and the social cost and the approach that will determine who will be the winners and the losers in that process, right? So between or amongst the three candidates, I think we can see very clearly from their vision and mission document, from their answers during the debates, the official debates, that even though all three of them have mentioned their commitment to energy transition, their approach and the underlying interest or commitment is rather different. Like there's clear differentiation, where at least on paper, what Prabowo has been promising is a message of continuation. So whatever speed it has been in the past 10 years, that will at least be the speed that he will be maintaining for the better or worse. And secondly, the way the messages of downstreaming, of industrialization, of battery production, and gradual transition is what he has been championing, basically, right? And that also means again, in terms of the graduality of that transition is going to be what he's after, compared to probably, at least again based on the messaging. For example, candidate number 1 and number 3 offer a slightly different message, maybe in terms of speed and more bolder approach, which again is a policy position. I mean, there's always trade-offs and there's always prioritization, but that's the key differentiation. So now it's a question of how does that commitment translate into operational policy on the ground, right? How and whether or not he will be able to convene the right actors, the critical actors in the process, what kind of reforms he will introduce to state-owned enterprises, which are the backbone of this transition process, both for power generation as well as transportation sector, because they're both basically run or driven by state-owned enterprises, I think remains a big question.
Do you think that now, given, of course, Indonesia has a really big coal sector, and it is politically quite influential as it is elsewhere in the world, in the context of certain countries, and of course Indonesia gets, I think by the last measure that I checked, the majority of its energy does come from coal. And now some people have called not just the incoming administration's energy policy, but in fact all of the candidates' energy policies were quite unambitious by their measure. So I'm wondering if you feel like there has been influence from the kind of current status quo in the country, or if you feel like the coal industry has had an influence on kind of watering down a bit more of an ambitious target or goal.
Yeah, I think it has been a public secret that in the context of Indonesian political economy, the business or industrial interest and that of political interest are highly, highly intertwined. And this is true across 3 presidential candidates. It's not particular to the winner or any of the candidates, right? And this goes all the way back to just political system, the high cost of the political transaction cost in the country that requires a big, let's say, economic capital, financial capital, as well as social capital in order to win an election, right? So that is almost a given. So it's very difficult to separate the business interest, let's say, or the industry interest versus the public interest that's supposed to be represented more by in the election by the public candidates. That being said, I think there is, depending on the actors, there has been some analysis, for example, mapping out the political economy of each candidate, like which coal industry is related to this candidate versus that candidate, and what it would mean to the transition, right? But even within this context, the level of commitment to transition amongst the different industrial leaders are different, right? I think we can already see and sense that some of the business leaders have personal, maybe sometimes also driven by shareholder interest, already have a bigger push to transition out. Maybe they are bound by international commitments, or they are bound by their target export countries have more strict standards or measures that will require them to transition sooner. And in a way, they're actually at disadvantage and less competitive because of if the regulation is not progressive enough, for example. So we cannot see the industrial leaders in a kind of one-dimensional way. They also have a spectrum, a degree of interest and commitment towards transition. And so it's a matter of how, again, in the political economy and development moving forward, once the new administration is sworn in, how the more, let's say, progressive industry leaders can also play their cards and influence the process while the, let's say, status quo industry that tries to slow down the transition as much as possible are trying to do. So it is also a matter of how and whether the public can work together with those, let's say, more progressive industrial leaders, and how they can build political influence or like political demand enough so that even the old players, the old brown industry players, for example, know that they cannot anyway get away with this, and transition is ought to happen. It's a matter of speeding up moving forward.
There was a lot in what you just said, but you did mention international, and that, to me, that sprung into my mind China's influence currently on, especially on their investments in Indonesia and of course the nickel processing industry. And for those people that don't know, nickel is of course an essential component for batteries for electric cars, which are going to play a key role in the energy transition. And so I'm just wondering how do you see China's role in all of this? And do you think that, for example, they've been investing heavily in nickel processing factories, which are leading to an increase in coal usage, for example? Do you think that it's kind of a bit ironic where you have Indonesia wanting to jump into, being a major player on clean energy resources, required resources, but then at the same time, the processing of those resources is burning fossil fuels. So how do you see China's role in all of this?
Yeah. So exactly. I think when we talk about energy transition, it's a lot more complicated than we think, right? It's not as simple as switching off all the coal-fired power plants and then we have all like battery-powered, solar-powered, hydro energy-powered grid. But it's about everything in between, right? Whether you can do a just transition and low emission as well transition, and in the process, not you don't end up creating more emissions to justify for the transition. And when it comes to then where is the right path or the approach, the overall combination of sector, you need to zoom out a little bit, right? And then also see what's right. I think what's complicated here, given the international dynamics, as I mentioned, there is China, and where they are trying to exercise their influence and direct the type of transition that they are supporting versus probably a more like Europe market-driven type of influence. It also it matters then how the domestic industry leaders respond to those powers and who are the winners and losers in the domestic level as well, meaning that it's not just a matter of whether it's China versus Europe, for example, but it's also which of these two international influences benefit the status quo winners as well. So there are incentives maybe for some of the industry leaders here right now to be more in favor of battery production, of nickel mining, and so on and so forth, disregarding the potential issues or negative impacts on environment from that process. So this is why, and then the understanding of the general voters also matter, because if the general voters think that only at the surface level, this is energy transition, electric vehicles requires batteries, and battery production always equals like good clean energy. If they don't understand the complicated how complicated the transition is as a context, they can just on at face value see that this is good, right? So I think it comes together with education to the public as well, that it matters that the transition is done in a way that doesn't end up creating new problems, both environmentally but also socially.
I think that's a worldwide problem in terms of people not fully understanding, what, say, a particular leader says about something. They say, it's like you said, batteries equals clean energy, but it doesn't necessarily talk about the underlying, process method, for example, or the processing method. So I'm just wondering, actually, how is, in an Indonesian context, how does that look, especially with voters? Are they aware, by your estimation, of these kind of underlying issues, or is it a very surface level conversation?
I think it remains, unfortunately, a very surface level conversation. If I can compare this to 10 years ago, where environmental issue is the last question in the final round of presidential debate, there is a progress by way that now environmental topics gets their own stage as like the fourth round of vice presidential debate. So in terms of awareness level, there is that increase. There are many, many surveys showing the increase in percentage or share of Indonesian people and youth especially that are more aware of climate change as an issue. But there remains a huge, huge gap in understanding what kind of solutions that it actually takes to solve this problem, as well as when the question is shifted to whether they feel responsible or the government should take action immediately. That number of awareness drops. I don't remember the exact numbers right now, but I think you've seen some of these surveys out there. So I think in a glass half full way, it is a progress, but it's just a sobering moment to also realize that there's still a long way to go in terms of helping the voters, the electorates, to understand the deeper kind of more underlying type of interventions that we need. And what's very dangerous is actually this surface level understanding sometimes can be more dangerous than lack of understanding, because then sometimes it means that the narrative can be abused. The narrative of climate action can be abused to justify more environmental and social issues out of the type of intervention that the government chooses, right? So it is, we are where we are, glass half full, glass half empty. I think it's about continuing to also educate the voters beyond just influencing policy at the elite level, because at the end of the day, the lawmakers know that they can still get away with these things if or without the voters monitoring and like closely engaging the kind of policy that they're taking.
Now, speaking of voters, I know Indonesia, I think, has one of the largest young voting constituencies in the world for a democratic country. Now, from your work that you've been doing, what are young voters, or at least what your impression is of what they're saying about the recent election and about environmental issues and just in general in Indonesia? Like, as you mentioned, that people are getting a little more aware, but what other conversations are going on in young voters' minds lately?
Yeah. So the sad truth is, if we are zooming out and we're looking at the country as a whole, the young voters are not, or the majority of young voters are not voting based on issues, let alone, climate change as a priority, right? If we zoom out. The reality is many of them, and I'm not just talking about lower middle class, even middle class and some upper middle class have very limited civic education background or like understanding on politics to know that, or to develop a sense of ideology or like policy platform as a basis to vote, to cast their vote on, right? And rather majority, I think, remains voting for popularity or surface level understanding on what the program is, and thinking that some of the proposed vision and mission are good without having context on the technical context. So, and this is part of what we're trying to address through Vote Wisely as a movement. So That's the reality, and not to mention the social assistance program, for example. There's still, voters, young and adult, basically, voting because or like influenced by social assistance as an intervention. That being said, there is a growing critical mass. So if we zoom in a little bit, it is a positive message of a growing critical mass of young people who have better access to information, who actually care and are looking for or have been frustrated and like really care deeply about climate change. And they're, a big part of this critical mass is already, they're very nervous, they're very anxious because they know that this election holds a particular it is particularly key as it determines the next 5 years of policy, and 2030 is a big deadline for not just Indonesia but the whole planet, right? So, and for this specific group, they are again, they're very aware, they're very anxious about how, for example, the plan on building a new capital in the middle of nowhere. Forested land, even though it can be argued that some of it are industrial forests and what have you, but it's still going to change the landscape, the natural landscape of that area. And that's a big concern. They're bringing in a lot of investment to build a new capital, for example. That's a concern. The food estate program, for example, monoculture, vastland approach to producing food is scientists and I think like researchers have stated issues related to that. Even the free lunch program, depending on how that's being designed, may have significant environmental impact as well. So not to mention the energy transition program that's not very ambitious. It's not high up in the priority of the program of any of the candidates. So that's just, again, a sobering reality for this maybe smaller group, but actually growing, like very quickly growing and an important driver, their community leaders at the local level. And so the users of Vote Wisely as a website, so it's basically a website. You can check it out at bijakpemului.id. We provide information on the issues, including energy transition, the capital development, as I mentioned, and others. We have over 1 million, 1.2 or 1.4 by now, I think, users throughout the election cycle. And these are voters that really want to learn about what the candidates' issues are. We have a page comparing side by side 30 ideas, 30 proposals across the three candidates, and you can compare them side by side. We provide additional context from experts as well on whether or not this proposal is actually technically salient, technically like responsible or not, and stuff like that. And so we think that the fight from now to 2029 is that of broadening this critical mass, right? Getting more voters who care about the issues, want to educate themselves more on the issue, and have better political engagement and remain being politically engaged beyond the election that we just did.
It reminds me of, I think there was a survey that was quoted in Monga Bay, the publication recently about, I think it was done by, I've got it in my notes here, the Center of Economic Law Studies and Unitrend Research Institute in Indonesia. And they asked young voters about their thoughts on climate change and environmental issues. And I guess this kind of represents this critical mass that you're talking about, this growing number of people. And they quoted, I think it was above 80% of them said that, these environmental issues are important and that we do care about them. So I think you can see that there is some momentum coming from there. And I guess it kind of reminds me of a little bit of, you mentioned forests as well, and that I did want to talk about biofuels too, because that was another issue. And so I'm just wondering if there has been, because Indonesia is not a stranger to environmental issues as well. Even if we stop talking about coal, we can talk about the deforestation that's going on from like the palm oil industry. And for example, the incoming administration says they're going to expand biofuel production, and I'm sitting here wondering, how do you expand biofuel production without, causing more environmental damage in these forested areas. So I'm just wondering if there's also conversation amongst young people about those more, I guess, issues that you can really see with your own eyes, as opposed to, say, like an energy policy, which is a bit more of a, it doesn't really register in the mind as strongly as, a forest getting chopped down, for example. So I'm wondering if there has been any conversation on that as well.
It's very interesting. I think when we talk about voters, we need to break it down a little bit, especially in Indonesia, because it's a very vast archipelago, right? There's the urban voters and those voters in coastal areas, amongst the forest communities, and so on. And I think the level of awareness on forest related issues are lower amongst urban voters, actually, even though it's more visible by the eyes, but they're so remote and it doesn't feel like it affects them directly at all. It's much more difficult to talk about deforestation with urban voters. At least this has been my experience. I'm happy to be proven otherwise. That being said, when it comes to energy and coal, because especially in big cities where we've been talking about air pollution for some time now, it has reached a momentum during the ASEAN high-level meeting, for example. So this issue of coal transition is more visible actually lately because of the air pollution issue, including the electric vehicle as a topic. So that's one. That being said, amongst the more, let's say, climate woke audience, yes, deforestation is like the number one issue because the data, at least in the past 10 years, shows clearly that deforestation contributes more in terms of emissions to in Indonesia compared to energy sector, even though it's growing very quickly and may overtake in just a few years. But basically, so that's the reality. Now, on the topic of biofuel, I think the assumption or the narrative that the government has been selling is that it is not supposed to, or it shall not lead to more deforestation, because in a way they also admit, maybe sometimes not directly, but this is a way to absorb the spillover from the European palm oil ban, in a way, not ban, but they have restrictions. So the idea is it's not to generate new demand per se, it's to absorb this surplus of exports that are not entering the market. So, but we need more analysis, and unfortunately I haven't found one. Maybe there is one out there, but we need like a closer look at how much this new demand are simply reabsorbing the surplus versus driving, new demand and new needs and new justification to open up lands for monoculture palm oil. So this should be part of the conversation, right? And I don't think we have talked enough about intensification or like improving productivity in existing lands. There's a lot to be discussed and seen, and I think we need more, for example, agriculture experts, scientists to really look at how we can improve productivity, because there's been numbers being thrown around comparing Indonesia's and Malaysia's productivity level per hectare, for example. So where's the issue in that? And then, and in addition, how we can use the remaining degraded lands, both degraded lands that are legally categorized as forest estate, but also degraded land, especially which should be easier, that are in non-forest area, right? Those are, if we can think about how to productively use those degraded lands, it can potentially, it should be the priority to be using those lands as opposed to opening up new lands. But of course, there's always like technical issue on the grounds. It's unfortunate that in practice, because this is one of my like main topic of research as well years ago, is that sometimes it's much easier legally and economically to open up like new forested land if they're in like legally non-forest area, compared to degraded land categorized as forest area. Because it's maybe some of the audiences already knows this, but basically in Indonesia, the biophysical condition and the legal designation are two different things, or could be two separate things that doesn't match the reality on the ground. So that's part of a bigger issue. But first, we need to have a better planning and understanding on how big the demand is for biofuel and what that will translate into how we want to supply or meet those demand.
Yeah, no, it's a huge topic, and I hope it does get to a bit more airtime over in Indonesia, because it's also a global issue as well when you think about how much Indonesian forests contribute to carbon sequestration across the planet and help keep things stable as they are. So it does matter, not just to Indonesians but also the world too. So Afu, just being mindful of your time, I'd just like to ask you one final question, and I know this might be a bit of a big question, but what would you like to see happen in the coming years regarding Indonesia? And of course, you mentioned a lot about young voters. What would you like to see happen in the country over the coming years? What would be your ideal situation?
Sure. I think number one is accepting and looking at the reality that we're presented with right now, right? In terms of who won in the last election. So let's think about how to best optimize where we are right now. And I think the way to approach this is dividing what needs to change from within the system or the supply of public policy and what needs to change outside the system or the demand for good policy. So outside the system, and this is the part of the work that we will continue doing in Vote Wisely, is continue to build and grow this critical mass of engaged young, doesn't have to be like limited to young people per se, but engaged critical mass who are following the issues, who provide direct feedback to the government for any new policy development that they're doing, new bills being floored in the parliament, new presidential regulation and what have you, and ensuring that feedback loop as an input to the government is bridged well, is facilitated well. And that's a role that we would like to play more. And I'm sure that a lot of NGOs out there, civil society movements, what have you, have been doing that. And I think we need to do that in a more convened, organized way so that that can be taken into consideration. But it is a numbers game. So no matter how how critical those voices are, if it's not big enough, it's easy to just overlook. So it's a numbers game that we need to grow. From within the system, it is a matter of, in terms of my hope, right? It's promoting or bringing back the culture of the technocratic culture or evidence-based policymaking, bringing in the science into decision-making, bringing in the expertise, the taking time to consider the trade-offs amongst policy options and carefully selecting which one is best. Because I think the entrepreneurial minded administration in the past 10 years has applied an entrepreneurial approach to policymaking, which tends to taking high risk, entrepreneurs taking big risks, creating new business, maybe seeing legal constraints or legal loopholes as an opportunity. That's very entrepreneurial, not statesmanship. So bringing in the statesmanship, I think, and the technocratic, culture into policymaking. And this can be done through engaging, again, the young professionals, not always young professionals, but I think professionals with a reformist, but also pragmatic mindset that can converse and dialogue effectively with policymakers while also understanding the trade-offs and not, simply, putting the best option out there, because sometimes that's also a conversation killer. Like when you just you stay with your idealistic stance and not open to any scenarios. In reality, I studied public policy by training, right? So in reality, it's always a second best world. Like public policy making is about second best option, but it's about which second best option actually sides with the interest of the people versus the vested business interest, for example. So changing that bit by bit, both through leadership, through value-based leadership, through opening the door up for good talents to come into the government so that they can build, they can push or promote for good policy, and then finally, as a third hope, I guess, is like bridging these two well. So having good supply, like good technocrats inside the government, having engaged citizens outside, and bridging the two so that leads to like an ecosystem that enables good policy, progressive policy on climate change to happen that can go beyond any individual president. So it's not a matter, and this is like a main message that I've been saying as well. It's not about finding like a one messiah. Like, it's not like if we elect for the best presidential candidate, then that will solve everything. It's not about electing like one messiah that will save us all. It's about slowly, building the right system, inserting the system with good people, with good ideas, good talents, and science and expertise, so that we can make the right decision, undo some of the things that have been maybe not well informed enough, and in the long run minimizing, because I know we're already lost in the fight of getting to 2030 with like significant emission reduction probably, but I think we can still achieve, again, second best, like by 2030, what Indonesia can contribute, not only for itself, but also, as you said, to the world, because our forest plays such an important role as well.
Yeah, I think overall you're working on a very important project, Afu, and it's very encouraging to hear that there is engagement among the youth, and also not just youth but just young voters, and trying to make up for some shortfalls in as you said, the civic education and the civic duties. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts on all these really important issues, Afu. I really enjoyed talking to you. If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.